Thank you so much. This is a real honor and pleasure to be here again. Um, my previous presentation was with four other of my friends who contributed to the book. So that was just a 10-minute presentation, which we all contributed. So this will be a little bit lengthier, and I'll probably, just because of the difference in length, I'll probably enjoy it even that much more. First, I'd like to thank Andrew and the Institute for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. My presentation is going to be a little bit different than I'm used to. I mean, I'm used to focusing on the revolution, but with this one, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, but then we're going to go a little into the French and Indian War briefly, and then into the revolution, and then we'll talk about some other things that have to do with the later history of Black soldiers. And I have to remember to get my eyes on. I'll begin with a portion of the book's preface. In February 1831, Philadelphia Black businessman, abolitionist, and revolutionary veteran James Forten wrote William Lloyd Garrison, editor of the newly founded anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. In essence, Forten spoke against the American Colonization Society, an organization founded in 1816 to purchase and free American slaves, then resettle them on Africa's west coast. He ended his missive with this note. According to a statement made by ACS member Mr. Francis Scott Key, they have removed in 14 years about as many hundred immigrants. I will venture to say that at least 500,000 Black Americans have been born during the same period. We ask not their compassion and aid, and insisting us to emigrate to Africa. We're content in this land that gave us birth, and which many of us fought for, and many of our fathers fought and died during the war which established our independence. Now, Forten recalls here the soldiers and seamen of African descent who served in mostly integrated Continental Army and militia units, as well as on naval vessels for the cause of American independence. Forten continued. I well remember that when the New England Regiment marched through this city on September 2, 1781, on their way to attack the English army under the command of Lord Cornwallis, there were several companies of colored people, as brave men as ever fought. And I saw those brave soldiers who fought at the Battle of Red Bank under Colonel Greene, where Count Donop, the commander, was killed, and the Hessians defeated. All this appears to be forgotten now. And the descendants of these men, to whom we're indebted for the part they took in the struggle for independence, are intended to be removed to a distant and inhospitable country, while the immigrants of every other country are permitted to seek an asylum here from oppression, and to enjoy the blessings of both civil and religious liberty, equally with those who are entitled to it by birthright. Now, the New England Regiment that Forten tells of was the Rhode Island Regiment, reintegrated in early 1781, having 2 companies of African and Native American soldiers and 7 white companies. So it was roughly integrated because the companies were still segregated. And then here you have a picture of a portion of the regiment marching through Philadelphia on its way to Yorktown in 1781. 4 years earlier, on October 22, 1777, just over 3 months before the 1st Rhode Island was reenlisted as a segregated unit, it was a fully integrated corps, fighting alongside his brother regiment in the Battle of Fort Mercer in New Jersey. That event, as James Forten rightfully recalls, was a small but seminal victory for the American cause, and further proof that along with their white and indigenous comrades and men of African descent could stand steadfastly against an overwhelming force of well-trained European troops and win. It was also, as he notes, ample evidence that Black Americans deserved the rights enjoyed by their white-skinned brethren. Now, tonight I'll speak briefly of how our new book came about, and then give you a small sample of soldiers of African descent serving in America, centering mostly on the American Revolution. As to how the book came about, one question needs to be answered. How was it that a non-degreed retired career postal worker was asked by Don Troiani to provide the text for a book? And I'll try to make that long story short. I became involved in living history pastime in 1984, and with that as the prime catalyst, I began my writing shortly after. By the mid-1990s, with several published articles behind me, I was fully committed to researching and writing in my niche of the Revolutionary era, a vocation I followed in between family and work for 36 years, and I'm still following it post-retirement. Around 1995, I met Don Troiani for the first time. One Friday before heading to an event in New York, Jim Cochin took us to Don's to pose for a painting. In the event, I posed for two, the battle scene Lone Star with my friends, and here we are in the background trying to rescue the flag. And then Don asked me to pose for a single figure in my light infantry kit, which we were actually wearing for the weekend. And there's that. I was a bit younger then. That experience led to a series of trips to Connecticut over the years, usually with friends, to stand for other paintings, at times merely to pour, and at times merely to pour through Don's artifact collection. Back to my research. During my various outings, I would always come across material that had nothing to do with the subject I was working on. Looking to the future, I would copy any extraneous but interesting documents, thinking they may prove useful, and indeed they did. One of the earliest mentions I found of black soldiers was in a memoir by a 5th Massachusetts Regiment white veteran, Henry Hallowell, who gave this simple but fitting tribute to the men of African descent he served with. He noted, "In my company, there was 4 Negroes named Jephthah Ward, Job Upton, Douglas Middleton, and Pomp Simmons. Part of them called on me after their time was out. They were good soldiers." Now, looking into those veterans' military records, I found that Jephthah Ward had served 5 years, 1779 to 1783. Job Upton enlisted in May 1777 and was discharged after 1 year, while Douglas Middleton served 3 years beginning in April 1777. Pomp Simmons served 6 years, enlisting 19 March 1778 for 3 years and re-enlisting for the war in 1781. And to me, the most interesting point about Simmons is that he went south to Virginia under the Marquis de Lafayette in the light battalions that served in that campaign. It was a hard-marching summer campaign against Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis's army. Those operations precipitated the Yorktown siege. Now, Hallowell's comment, along with his black comrade's service, plus my reading of Benjamin Quarles's excellent 1961 book, The Negro in the American Revolution. And if you haven't read that and you're interested in the subject, you really should read it. I mean, it was published in the 1960s. It still holds up. My cousin and I were actually having a discussion about this. We feel that Mr. Quarles actually looked at that book as a building block. I mean, he covers the service of Black people and their experiences pretty widely, but a lot of research has come out since then. And as a book in itself, it's excellent. As a building block, it's just marvelous. That impetus led me to write my first article on the subject, titled "They Were Good Soldiers, African Americans Serving in the Continental Army, 1775 to 1783. That was completed in 2007. A second, more in-depth work was my 2016 online article, "At Eutaw Springs, He Received 3 Wounds, Black Soldiers in Southern Continental Regiments." That second work came to the attention of an editor at Helion Press, who asked me to do a book on the subject, and that tome was published in 2019 under the title, "They Were Good Soldiers." And that second article, actually, if you get my card, you can actually find or send me an email. I can send you that second article, so you can actually get the information for free. I'm not a very good businessman. In the end, while I cannot speak for Don, I assume my published work on Black soldiers, plus our personal connection, led to his asking me to be involved. When the phone call came in about August 2022, I was surprised. I was very surprised. I didn't know that he knew my work on Black soldiers, but Don can be a really surprising person. Now, before I continue, a concise description of our new book. Centering on Don Troiani's artwork, the fully sourced narrative and image captions cover the story of men of African descent who, through 111 years and 4 wars, served in or attached to the militaries of 5 nations and 1 stillbirth country: Britain, including Canada, the United States, Spain, France, Germany, and the Southern Confederacy. The wars covered are the French and Indian War, the War of the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the American Civil War. Along the way, integration, segregation, and exclusion in 4 European militaries are set against American military practices. Add to that, the ever-changing United States policies towards Blacks in the military are one focal point of the narrative. So let's turn back to 1756. That year, South Carolina Governor William Littleton wrote, "The number of Negroes in this province greatly overbalances that of the whites, and in case of an attack might prove an intestine enemy. Despite that, by law, in order to augment white militia soldiers, Masters were required to make out lists of their male slaves between the ages of 16 and 60 and return them to the captains of their respective companies, making special note of such as were faithful. These were armed and pressed into service in time of alarm and actual invasion. The proportion of slaves in companies outside of Charleston was never to exceed 1/3, nor in Charleston 1/2 the whole number. Furthermore, slaves and white servants, for taking prisoner one of the enemy or capturing his colors, gained their freedom, the masters to be reimbursed out of the public treasury. Slaves who were especially brave in time of action, but had performed neither of the deeds mentioned above, received from the public treasurer yearly and every year a livery coat and a pair of breeches made of good red negro cloth, turned up with blue, and a black hat and a pair of black shoes, and shall that day and every year during their lives on which such action was performed be freed and exempted from all personal labor and service to their owner. And despite those rewards, of course, those veterans would still remain enslaved for their lifetimes. The 1756 general return of the officers and men in the Charlestown Regiment of Foot shows 744 effective private men, 137 alarm men, and 608 slaves. Thus, each militia company enrolled between 150 or 100 and 150 enslaved men alongside an only slightly higher number of white militiamen. Now, previous to my book, there's never been a comprehensive study of Black soldiers in the French and Indian War. There's been articles, but there were still some blank spots that I had to fill in, and then put it all together to form a whole. And suffice it to say, regarding Black soldiers, practices in the French and Indian War American provincial units may possibly surprise many. As we noted, South Carolina used enslaved soldiers and some free blacks, while North Carolina used small numbers of free men of African descent, and possibly also enslaved men. Maryland barred black men from serving, and Virginia enlisted them only to serve in unarmed roles. Pennsylvania had few of any black soldiers, while its lower counties, the colony of Delaware, enlisted small numbers of blacks and Indians. At present, nothing is known of black men serving with New Jersey forces. I actually just recently found, yesterday actually, from my cousin, I found of at least one black soldier who served in the New Jersey regiment during the French and Indian War. When African men served under arms in the aforementioned colonies, they were largely in the ranks alongside their white comrades. Matters were much different in the northern colonies, where New York and New England regiments all included armed black soldiers, both free and enslaved, and in much greater numbers. Those black troops saw service from Canada to Cuba and every point in between. Numbers in Connecticut and Massachusetts were the greatest. So unable to go into more detail on the subject of the French and Indian War, I just want to let one Massachusetts soldier stand for the rest. Mulatto John Bush first served in the latter stages of the 1744-1748 King George's War, at times stationed in the Connecticut River in New Hampshire. John had two brothers who took part in the French and Indian War. Joseph participated in the 1755 Crown Point expedition and died in April 1756. And George, who died in service October 1759. John enlisted in Dwight's regiment in November 1755, likely serving at Fort William Henry. And in March 1756, he transferred to Captain Joseph Ingersoll's company, and that October was appointed captain's clerk. So he was literate. John Bush signed on again in 1757, serving in Colonel Jonathan Bagley's regiment at Fort William Henry. And now these are all Massachusetts regiments. At Fort William Henry on the southern end of Lake George, New York. While serving in the military, John augmented his pay by engraving powder horns for fellow soldiers. His first known carved horn dates from 1747. Among others, he decorated horns for Captain Robert Rogers of Rogers Rangers and Ranger Captain Israel Putnam, later a Major General in the Continental Army. John Bush was with the Fort William Henry garrison during the 6-day August siege, surrendering with the garrison on the 9th. Rumors spread afterwards of a wholesale massacre by French allied natives as the defeated British marched from the fort, and that black members of the army were the first to be taken and killed. In fact, the Indians and some French, knowing black slaves were valuable, pulled men of African descent from the ranks in order to sell them later. There were horrible depredations, but they were exaggerated, and of the 1,500 man garrison, some 385 soldiers and civilian followers were killed, and another 300 to 500 taken captive. Somehow, perhaps because he was a light-skinned mulatto, John Bush was not enslaved but remained with the other prisoners, redeemed from the Indians. Having lost one son already and worried about John, George Bush Sr. wrote the Massachusetts governor from Shrewsbury, September 14, 1758. Honorable Sir, I have a son in captivity at Canada, if he be living, that was taken last year at Lake George when that was reduced. I never heard from him since he was taken. Only when our men returned, they say he was not killed, but carried off by the Indians. His name is John Bush, a mulatto fellow, about 30 years of age. Pray, sir, if there be any opportunity to exchange captives, let my son be remembered. I'd be much obliged, George Bush. Unfortunately, John Bush's luck did not hold out. The October 12, 1758 Boston Newsletter published a list of men who had been shipped overseas, including Bush and 5 others who had died on board in their passage to France. The next portion narrows our focus, being an overview of men and some women of African descent serving with the Continental Army. Segregated regiments and smaller units were formed during the War of the American Revolution, but they were not the norm. Here are the 4 most predominant. The earliest was the Loyalist Ethiopian Regiment, formed in 1775 with freed slaves, mostly from Virginia. By rule of Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore. That unit was actually much reduced by disease, and it was disbanded after 1 year. It was also very controversial. It was not really agreed to by the powers that be in Britain, and also the commander-in-chief in America, to form a black regiment. 6 months later, in March 1777, British Commander-in-Chief Sir William Howe directed that all Negroes, mulattoes, and other improper persons who have been admitted into Loyalist Corps be immediately discharged. In essence, this meant that armed blacks were not allowed to serve in Crown-established Loyalist regiments. And I found, and others have also found, that as the war went on, that was not entirely followed, but they mostly served in unarmed roles. The next form was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, filled with freed slaves, free blacks and Indians, and as well as veteran black and Indian soldiers who had served previously. From 1775 through 1777, all the Rhode Island regiments were integrated. Manpower shortfalls led to the early 1778 decision to make the 1st Regiment a quote-unquote black regiment, or black corps, and recruit it with newly freed black and Indian slaves. Conversely, the 2nd Rhode Island became a segregated white organization. And segregated white organizations in the Continental Army was a rarity, because from the beginning to the end, the Continental Army was integrated. Possibly due to its June 1778 cutoff for enlisting slaves, the regiment never attained field strength and remained in Rhode Island for the remainder of its service. In January 1781, the 2 companies remaining were combined with the 2nd Regiment to form the Rhode Island Regiment. That unit contained 2, again, quote-unquote, black and 5 white companies. Few know that while the reformed 1st Regiment was enlisting in Rhode Island in spring 1778 during the Valley Forge winter, the veteran black and Indian soldiers from both regiments were formed into a single company at Valley Forge. That company belonged to the 1st Rhode Island, but for the time being formed with the 2nd Regiment, and in that manner fought bravely at the Battle of Monmouth. So at the Battle of Monmouth, with an integrated army, which Washington was fighting with, there was one single black company, actually black and Indian company. In March 1779, the French military formed the Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue in what later became known as Haiti. The regiment consisted of free men of color, with blacks and mulattoes separated into their own companies, reflecting the colorism rife in Saint-Domingue society. Their only large-scale action was at the siege of British-held Savannah in autumn 1779. Most of the unit was disbanded by late 1779 or early 1780, but elements served to 1784 on one of the Sugar Islands. And lastly, the Havana battalions of free blacks and mulattoes, segregated by color, were first formed in 1762, previously having operated only by companies. Now, the story of the companies of free blacks and mulattoes is really interesting, and they fought at the siege of Havana in 1762, and some enslaved soldiers were pressed into service or volunteered into service, and actually, as a result of their actions, they were freed and then joined the Havana battalion. Men of color joining these units enjoyed a rise in societal status, plus special benefits for themselves and their families. Picked detachments served in ad hoc grenadier and light companies during the 1781 operations to take Pensacola, Florida, where they fought well. that remained well regarded into the 19th century. So much so that in 1795, one of their chronic detractors felt compelled to state they were, quote, without a doubt, some of the best soldiers in the world. Now, contrary to those examples, and I just have to restate it, the Continental Army was thoroughly and constantly integrated from the first day of the conflict to its last, while British regiments handling black musicians, servants, and laborers, and most loyalist units followed suit. And this is my friend Antoine Watts. Now for the beginning of the Continental Army and the beginning of black men serving in the Continental Army. Black Americans were in the fight from the first. Massachusetts militiamen of color, free and enslaved, fought alongside their white comrades from Lexington to Concord and back to Boston on April 19, 1775. To date, we have the names of at least 35 black men present that day, at least 18 seen combat. One, Prince Estabrook, was wounded with Captain John Parker's on Lexington Green. It's likely that as many as 40 to 50 African Americans were with the militia on the war's first day. 2 months later, at least 88 black and 15 Indian soldiers are known to have served at the 17 June Bunker Hill battle. One historian estimates the total may have been as high as 150, roughly 5% of American troops involved. Now, there are several mentions of black participation in those early actions, but this is my favorite. Speaking to the courage and resilience of African American soldiers and the effect one man's determination had on another, John Greenwood, a white soldier, noted, "Everywhere the greatest terror and confusion seemed to prevail. As I ran along the road leading to Bunker Hill, it was filled with chairs and wagons bearing the wounded and dead. Never having beheld such a sight before, I felt very much frightened." And you can put yourself in his place and actually almost feel the same thing. I could positively feel my hair stand on end. Just as I came near the place, a Negro man, wounded in the back of his neck, passed me, and his collar being open and he not having anything on except his shirt and trousers, I saw the wound quite plainly, and the blood running down his back. I asked him if it hurt much. He said no, that he was only going to get a plaster put on it and meant to return. You cannot conceive what encouragement this immediately gave me. I began to feel brave and like a soldier from that moment, and fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war. Now, despite their proven ability, some African Americans were early on deemed unfit for continental service. It started with enslaved men. In May 1775, Massachusetts provincial resolution stated that no slaves be admitted into this army upon any consideration whatsoever. And that happened a lot in New England regiments, but it also happened in other colonial and state regiments too. So much so that some people actually made fun or were derogatory towards the New Englanders, especially for hiring enslaved men to fight for their freedoms without freeing them. By contrast, in October 1775, Council of Officers agreed unanimously to reject all slaves and by a great majority to reject Negroes altogether, while November 12 Army Order directed neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the campaign are to be enlisted. Now, there's some confusion here too, because in the wording, Negro at the time, and we'll actually come back to this, Negro at the time meant an enslaved person. There were some times when it was actually used meant to refer to all blacks, but legally and in Army orders, by and large, they meant enslaved persons. In this one, this use of Negro actually refers to both free and white black people. Signaling a change of policy at the end of December 1775, General George Washington told of numbers of free Negroes who were desirous of enlisting, giving leave to the recruiting officers to entertain them. Now, a side note: many people have taken this whole exchange to say that after 1775, Washington's army was segregated. There were no blacks in that army, and unfortunately, to this day, in a lot of books, that is still written in books and believed by authors. As a side note, African Americans were never evicted from the Army and continued to serve during the 8-month paper exercise of deciding if they should be soldiers or not. Now, my cousin actually found this smoking gun order Given the desperate need to fill Continental regiments, General Washington's February 21, 1776 recruiting instructions stated that officers were expressly forbid enlisting any boys, old men, or slaves, with no mention of barring free blacks. Eventually, individual states began allowing enslaved soldiers as well, and by 1778, they formed a sizable minority in Washington's army. Thus, the American Army remained a racially integrated organization to the war's end, and black musket-bearing soldiers, Continentals and militia, fought in every major battle of the war and in most, if not all, of the lesser actions. A number of observers noted the fact of African Americans in the ranks, some unfavorably, with the claim they were unsuited to be soldiers, but positive remarks were in the majority. In response to John Adams' October 1775 question about black soldiers in the Massachusetts regiments, Adams called them unsuitable for service. General William Heath replied, "There are in the Massachusetts regiments some few lads and old men, and in several regiments some Negroes. Such is also the case with the regiments from the other colonies. Rhode Island has a number of Negroes and Indians. Connecticut has fewer Negroes, but a number of Indians. The New Hampshire regiments have less of both." And now in this letter, the term Negroes refers to actually both free and enslaved blacks. The men from Connecticut, I think, in general, are rather stouter than those of either of the other colonies, but the troops of our colony are robust, agile, and as fine fellows in general as I would ever wish to see in the field. And General John Thomas was more emphatic. "In the regiments at Roxbury, the privates are equal to any that I served with last war, very few old men, and in the ranks, very few boys. We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general equally serviceable with other men for fatigue and inaction. Many of them have proved themselves brave. Europeans were also complimentary. The Negro can take the field in his master's place, hence you never see a regiment in which there are not a lot of Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them." And now, with this relatively complimentary passage, he's also referring to especially the New England habit of substituting slaves for your own service to fight. And Baron Ludwig von Closen, aide-de-camp to French General Rochambeau, wrote in July 1781, "I had a chance to see the American army, man for man. It is really painful to see these brave men almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings, but, would you believe it? Very cheerful and healthy in appearance. It is incredible that soldiers composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, so unpaid and rather poorly fed, can march so fast and withstand fire so steadfastly." As for numbers, Closen claimed a quarter of Washington's army were Negroes, merry, confident, and sturdy. Regarding Closen's estimate of numbers, my research shows that it is high. It's possible that, well, we do know that numbers of black soldiers did increase as the war went on for a number of reasons. But it's more likely that by 1781, they were probably maybe 15% of the army. But again, that's just a guess because numbers are hard to come by. Now we'll look a bit more at numbers. At the onset of the War for Independence, approximately 480,000 African Americans lived in the colonies, of whom roughly 24,000 were free, meaning some 456,000, 95%, were enslaved. Total American population at the time was approximately 2.5 million. Using these numbers, free blacks comprised less than 1% of the overall population, and slaves formed 18%. Roughly 5,000 to 7,000 African American soldiers and sailors, free and slave, served this revolutionary cause. And that is an estimate, 5,000 to 7,000. In August 1778, a document entitled "A Return of Negroes in the Army" tallied the number of black soldiers in 15 brigades of General George Washington's main army. Now, the use of the term Negro and the fact that in army documents, especially as the war went on, and the legal documents, Negro meant an enslaved person. This is all based on an upcoming study, which is almost done, really, by Matthew C. White, an historian. He basically determined what I'm just about to tell you. Long thought to enumerate all the black men in those brigades, in mid to late 18th century North American official parlance, the name Negro alluded to enslaved people. Thus, that list shows there were 755 slave soldiers in Washington's army that month. In a force totaling almost 21,000 rank and file, corporals, music, and private soldiers, they comprised 3.6% of the whole, and by themselves, enslaved soldiers conformed two understrength regiments, each equal to or larger in size than most other serving Continental regiments. We have no idea how many free blacks were then serving, but they were possibly at least on par with their enslaved comrades. Again, we don't know. They could have been fewer than enslaved soldiers. We just don't know. But if they were on a par, then 7.2% of the force in question were free and enslaved black men. The return of Negroes does not include the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment, as those enslaved men who joined that unit were freed upon enlistment. So they were not slave soldiers, they were freedmen. Still in 1778, that corps was near the height of its strength. That July contained 190 soldiers of color, including 182 black men, 6 Indians, and 2 mustees, mustee meaning mixed African Indian. Of those, 44 were veterans and 146 newly enlisted. So Don will probably be upset because I'm not using all his artwork, but this is actually an excellent painting. This, as you can see, is from the Museum of the American Revolution. Here we have a modern image of a single company of Henley's Additional Regiment in 1779. That's a good representation of how many Continental companies would have appeared, with some having a few more black soldiers and others perhaps none at all. As seen in our discussion of the 1778 Army return, the proportion of African American soldiers was relatively small, but that's not as important as their mere presence in mixed regiments. One reason is the equation of military service with citizenship, a concept that continued at least into the mid-18th century, or mid-19th century. More importantly, foreign observers and others likely considered African Americans serving alongside white soldiers as a radical revolutionary statement. And believe me, a good portion of the American Revolution was a radical revolution. That statement was almost on a par with taking up arms against the King's Army and the Declaration of Independence. It may have been an unintentional and to some an unwelcome political statement, but it was just as powerful as the purposeful and just as pragmatic arming of blacks during the 1860s American Civil War. From numbers, we'll turn to one soldier's story. Of all the black Virginia Continentals I've found, Andrew Pebbles had perhaps the most varied career. In his pension testimony, Pebbles noted he didn't recall the year he enlisted, being a poor, unlearned mulatto. According to his military records, it was September 15th, 1777. So that's even before the Valley Forge campaign. That's still the Philadelphia campaign, or Valley Forge encampment. He joined the Army at Valley Forge and was placed under the command of Captain Lewis Booker, 11th Virginia Regiment, for 2 years. At Trenton, he served 1 year in the artillery under Captain William Miller, 1st Continental Artillery Regiment, who commanded the gun with 12 men to which he belonged. He served for 2 years under Captain Micah Rudolph of Maryland in the light infantry commanded by Colonel Harry Lee, father of Robert E. Lee, whose command was composed of infantry and cavalry and called Lee's Legion. He was in 3 general actions at Monmouth, Guilford Courthouse, and at Eutaw Springs. At Eutaw Springs, he received 3 wounds. He was wounded in the shoulder slightly, lost the thumb of the left hand, and was bayoneted in the belly. He was discharged on Combahee River honorably. The day before he was discharged, he was in the battle in which Colonel John Lawrence, who commanded in the absence of Colonel Lee, was killed. That was on August 27, 1782. Now, Peebles, though a free man, had to deal with the issue of slavery post-war. And actually, most black veterans, if they were free, they still had to deal with the issue of slavery. In his pension, Pebbles testified, "By occupation, I'm a miller. From the infirmities of old age, increased by the wounds received in the Revolutionary War, I'm not able to render much service to my employer. I am a free mulatto. My wife and child who live at the mill where I do are slaves. My wife's name is Rachel, aged between 50 and 60 years, and my child's name is Ursula, aged 11 years. And just in case you don't know it, slavery passed down through the mother. So if the father was free, the mother was enslaved, the children were enslaved. Several other Southern veterans told of enslaved family members when they applied for pensions in the early 19th century. Augmenting those that you can see on screen, in 1789, West New Jersey Revolutionary veteran Jacob Francis struck another small blow for freedom. Former slave Phyllis Duncan testified. She was present and saw Mary Francis married to Jacob Francis by Cato Finley. At the time of said marriage, Phyllis and Mary and Francis and Cato Finley all lived with and were the slaves of Nathaniel Hunt, where the marriage took place. Jacob Francis, immediately after his marriage, bought Mary from her master Nathaniel Hunt. Mary, in a few days, left the employ of Hunt and went with her husband, and since that time lived together as a man and wife until the death of Jacob, and raised a family of children. Now here we're getting to my first book, because as much as I would have loved to, there was just no room to include women in the new book, but I do have them in the first book. In my first book, I mentioned African American women who, by their own free will or the will of others, served with the Army. To correct the popular idea of Army women, black and white, they were, by and large, respectable and respected. Any women who were not long tolerated. I've discovered a number of black women with the Army, some of them servants. One of those was Hannah Till, who served in General Washington's military household and gave birth to a son at Valley Forge. And actually, I have to tell you right now, Matthew White is my cousin. He's an excellent researcher, but he actually found out that Hannah Till was actually on the Pennsylvania side when Washington's army crossed to New Jersey to attack Trenton, and her enslaved husband was actually in the attack on Trenton. Another was Sarah, a slave who emancipated herself and her son and joined the 1st Maryland Regiment for several months in 1778. But I want to focus on one woman, Judith Lynes, and read a portion of a letter written to her by her husband, John, published for the first time in my first book. To preface the letter, John Lynes enlisted in the 5th Connecticut Regiment in March 1781 for 3 years. Part of his time was spent at West Point and other Hudson Highland posts. By Judith Lynes' own testimony, they married in July 1781. She recalled, "The next summer after I married, he sent for me to come to him. I think the place was called the Highlands. At that time, my husband was a waiter to Colonel Sherman, and while at the camp, I had the smallpox. I think I stayed about 3 or 4 months." Mrs. Lynes noted in a pension application, "My husband used to write to me when he was in the Army, and I have one of his letters now, which I give to the magistrate, who takes this my deposition. It is dated November 11, 1781, and is in the handwriting of my husband." Now, John's letter. "I take this opportunity to send you, my dear and loving wife, to let you know that I am well and hoping these lines may find you and the children well. This is the 6th letter of mine, and I haven't received one. I belong to Colonel Isaac Sherman's regiment and Captain Rice's company. We lay at Fishkill now. I should be very glad if you would send me a letter how you have lived this summer, and whether the house is done, and whether you killed that cow or whether you have got another. I want to know all these things very much. I intend to come home this winter if I can, but I don't know if I can. If I could see you myself, then I could talk with you, my dear wife, as I like. I've seen hard times. I have lived 11 days with bread only. I remain your loving husband until death, John Lynes." I won't go too much more into Judith, but I will say that if you may have noted that she had smallpox in the service, and anybody that knows about smallpox, it was a horrific disease, but she did survive, though she may have been scarred with pox marks on her body and face. And also, I have an entire article, a pretty lengthy article, just on John Lynes and Judith Lynes. So if anybody would like to see that, I could send you that too. Black soldiers' motivation for joining the Continental Army and their treatment while serving are important to any discussion of their military service. The reasons somewhat mirrored those of their fellow white and Indian soldiers. Some fought for national independence and hoped for opportunities in a new republic. Some joined for the adventure of military service, sometimes connected to the prospect of serving alongside family and friends. Others were at least partly enticed by the lure of an enlistment bounty or regular pay. And after the ideals espoused in the Declaration of Independence, some men fought for their own freedom or for that of their loved ones. Some joined as paid substitutes in the place of those who could afford the fee. Forced service was another factor. If they were on the militia rolls, both white and black men periodically faced the chance of being drafted for short-term into the Continental Army. Whites were occasionally compelled to enlist, but enslaved African Americans were more often coerced or forced by their masters to serve. Many, especially in New England, were promised freedom in return for military service. Now, at first, and for much of the war, that was not a state promise, or that was actually the master's promise, so it was not an overall promise. Most of those promises were honored, but some veterans were kept in bondage after their discharge. Of course, the major dividing line between white and black common soldiers was the American system that enslaved 95% of the country's African Americans and relegated blacks to underclass status. In light of their treatment in civilian society. One remarkable result researching Black Continental soldiers is finding that they largely received the same consideration as the white comrades. Um, if anybody's familiar with the Civil War, you know that Black troops um, early on were paid differently. They were paid less than the white regiments, and that was a big point of contention. Not so with the American Revolution. At the most basic level, soldiers of color, both African and Native Americans, received the same pay, provisions, clothing, and equipment as white soldiers. Both whites and soldiers of color suffered together in times of scarcity and jointly enjoyed the rare times of bounty. The most glaring case of unequal treatment was that Black soldiers were, with very few exceptions, barred from serving in any other rank than drummer, fifer, or private soldier. There were inequities. Early in the war, Africans were occasionally singled out for labor details, but that ended by 1778. There were also indications that Black enlisted men served as officers, waiters, servants more often than white soldiers, but that remains unsubstantiated. And I honestly don't think that was the case. I think that actually Black soldiers and white soldiers were taken pretty much equally, but it's possible considering the circumstances that they were taken out more often. And finally, while there were likely difficulties due to officers or fellow soldiers' personal or race animus, to date no such instances have come to light, at least to me or to people, the other researchers that I know. Now, this chart is not in the book, but it's actually based on the findings in the book. Black men, Americans and others, were indeed good soldiers. Even when faced with the growth of racism beginning in the late 18th century, racial animosity, and beginning in the late 18th century, racial animosity was reflected in the military too, beginning with integration and inclusion in most 1750s and 1760s American provincial forces and in continental forces and state militias during the War of the Revolution. The exclusion of Black men in the Army and militia first took hold in the 1790s, though not by government statute. By 1812, integration was back, with support or lack thereof already split between North and South. The ban on Black soldiers in federal regiments is tied to the ascent of Southern commanders before, but especially after, the War of 1812. Towards the end of that conflict, with James Monroe as Secretary of War and men such as South Carolinian George Izard in high command and Virginian Winfield Scott a rising star, there seems to have been a sub rosa movement to cull Black men from the Army. Oddly enough, one piece of evidence was included in a private soldier's enlistment record, where Colonel and North Carolinian Henry Atkinson noted, "Discharged under an order from the War Department directing all soldiers of color should be discharged." That can be paired with Major General Izard's July 1814 letter to Pennsylvania Secretary of War John Armstrong, who was from Pennsylvania, concerning newly arrived Black recruits. Izard posed a quasi question, noting that there was some years ago a regulation of our service prohibiting the service or the enlistment of Blacks and people of color. I have not heard of it being enforced. And actually, he was wrong. There was some militia barring of Black men of color or men of color in the late 1790s, and that seems to have gone over to the federal army too, because there were mentions that they definitely were not enlisting Black men. But that changed by 1803. There was actually an army order stating that they could enlist free men, able-bodied free men, and that included Black men. In 1817, President Monroe appointed South Carolinian John C. Calhoun as Secretary of War, a position he occupied until 1825. Calhoun had a profound impact on the United States Army, including a comprehensive reorganization and the creation of the West Point Military Academy. Concurrent with the Missouri Compromise, Calhoun implemented a ban on Black soldiers, not via federal law, but in a mundane February 18, 1820 Army order regarding recruiting. Issued by the Adjutant and Inspector General's office, it directed, "No Negro or mulatto will be received as a recruit of the Army." Following that, Winfield Scott's 1821 General Regulations for the Army or military institutes restricted enlistment to all free white male persons. That stricture explains why no Black men served as soldiers in federal regiments during the war with Mexico. And again, I actually learned just yesterday that Matt White has actually found at least one Black man who continued to serve in the federal army into the later 1820s and possibly into the 1830s. He was he was one of the few, possibly the only one that we know of. Also, in 1825, there was another army order or army regulation that basically held up the fact that no black men, only free white men would be enlisted. Now I'll close out the main part of my presentation, and just my secondary part is not that long, so don't be too frightened. The main part of my presentation was an excerpt from the January 1865 letter by Sergeant John Collins, 54th Massachusetts Regiment, written from South Carolina. As I write, it rains quite hard and has done so for some days. The mud is quite deep and our shelter very poor. It is very hard living at this time. We are all destitute of clothes, and some of us have not as much as a shoe upon our feet. But when we look at the suffering condition of the poor slaves, we can stand all. Only give us our liberty and freedom, and we will give our lives for liberty, for we love that well-known sound. Now, just a few more things before I yield the floor. There we go. Soon after submitting the book's manuscript, I was told that the narrative needed to be halved. Luckily, I have a lot of experience, and I was able to do that pretty quickly and without really harming the thesis. But several in-depth studies were cut from the book, leaving standalone manuscript or monographs. And I have cards in the back. If you're actually interested in the work on Judith Lines, if you're interested in this material, just send me an email and I'll send it to you. Here are links to more of my work. I actually have one collection of articles on African Americans in the war, and actually I have a couple on Indians now too. I've expanded a little bit, and then there's a link to my my collected articles, and finally the book cover and contents. I want to thank you very much for listening, and that's it.
If I can kindly ask you to raise your hand, I'll bring you a microphone.
Hi, thank you very much. Could you tell us what surprised you the most as you were doing your research? Stories, things that you weren't expecting that you want to share with us that were kind of surprising and interesting about this research?
Well, one of the things is that that doesn't really surprise me that much, and it's probably maybe a little off topic, but the fact that the treatment of people of color in this country basically led to these books, because otherwise these men would just be considered American soldiers. One of the things that did surprise me, and I've already talked about, was the treatment of black soldiers in the Continental Army and the States Militia. It was pretty much the same. I mean, they were limited in rank. I think there was at least one sergeant, possibly two sergeants, black sergeants. There were, I think, several corporals. But in the Rhode Island Regiment, there was a shortage of corporals. Two men were promoted out of the company, so there were black men who were promoted to corporal. And when the regiment was reduced, they were reduced back to the ranks, and white men were put in their place. So there was inequity, but compared to the American Civil War, there was nowhere near the same inequity. The pension papers have marvelous stories in them. I mean, you have to, and that's black, white, Indian stories. I mean, there's just really remarkable stories in there. I mean, sometimes you have to wade through a lot of mundane, very cut and dried narratives, and then you'll come across something that has, like, sometimes it's just one detail that just blows you away, and sometimes it's actually a little narrative that all of a sudden you're in this guy's place. I found one. This guy wasn't a black soldier, but one white soldier who was a short-term 9 months enlistee, and because of his short-term service, he remembered his service really, really vividly, and he wanted to talk about it, and in order to get the pension. And he talks about, being housed in a meeting house when the British left Philadelphia, being attacked while they're sleeping in the meeting house, being detached from the New Jersey Brigade to basically go around the British and harass them on the march. And then at the Battle of Monmouth, hearing Washington say to General Charles Lee after Lee's retreat at the beginning of the battle, saying what he said he clearly heard, what is this you have been about today? I mean, there's all kinds of different, there's reams of information saying that, or accounts that say that Washington swore to the heavens, and but there's enough information out there that shows that he pretty much kept his cool. And just with that statement, if that was his true statement, it was probably said in a way that Lee really knew that Washington was upset. But that came out of a pension paper. There are camp followers who are, I'm sorry, women with the Army, try to get away from that old moniker. Women with the Army who actually either add to their husband's pensions, or they put in their own pensions based around their husband, but they actually tell about what they did in the Army and where they went. So that may not be surprising to researchers in the field, but yeah, I mean, the thing is, you can access those online. If you have a library card, you can access those on Ancestry for free. And in other places, you can, like pay sites, you can actually access them from home. So yeah, pretty amazing. I'm sorry, go ahead.
How did you and your cousin both become so interested in a similar topic? That's quite a coincidence.
I'm 69 and he's in his 40s. And I remember him when he was a very small child, when he was a baby, really. But early on, he became interested in history. And I guess he saw, because I started living history in 1984, and he probably saw me, out at events and things like that. I know he was out a few times. When he actually got involved in living history, he was actually involved in the Civil War aspect of it. But he started researching pretty quickly. He's scary smart. He's pretty amazing. But yeah, it was just a strange thing that he really was interested in, like, the history from the common soldier's point of view. I mean, early on, when he first started in college, he was really interested in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and he did a lot of research and writing on the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Then he wrote about the Black Army Corps in Texas, after, at the end of the war and then post-war, when the troubles in Mexico, and how some of those black soldiers were actually released from the regiments to go to fight with the rebels in Mexico. They were released by their officers to go fight. He's found a lot of amazing things, and I'm I'm feeling my age in some ways, but I still get excited, when I'm researching or when I find things. But he's an amazing researcher, and he just digs and digs and digs and digs. And the piece he's working on now, it started as a discussion of why did they make that return of the Negroes in the Army? Why did they do that? It doesn't really make sense, and there's nothing in the letters, the correspondence, that gives a reason why they did that. And as my cousin was saying, he said, well, returns were only made for several reasons. They were made to find out how many effective men you had, like before a battle, or if you're thinking of going into action or on a campaign. Like returns of women were made because they were somewhat of a liability, because returns were made for rations for women. And women were kept in the Army at the sufferance of the command staff, because they knew if they rid the women of the Army, a lot of the soldiers would follow them. And the fact that there were enslaved soldiers fighting in the Army was not a good look for the Army. It was not a good look for the cause of independence. And I mean, he's done so much research on state statutes and the use of Negro in legal terms. And I mean, I'm fully convinced that return is a return of enslaved soldiers. I mean, others may not be convinced, but I've been around the block a lot, but block in the research field and the Revolutionary era, and yeah.
I have two questions for you. First one is, could you talk a little bit about the transition of George Washington to his acceptance of having and recruiting Blacks into the American Army? And then could you talk about specifically the Indian tribes? I think there was only really one major tribe, the Oneidas, who supported Washington. The rest were on the British side.
Mhm.
Were those Indians who served in the Continental Army, were they Oneidas? Or I knew a big group of them came to Valley Forge, but in other regiments, were they from Oneida, or were they recruited from other tribes?
The Oneidas basically they served in a corps by themselves, so they remained embodied when they did serve. The ones that I've found, and I've been doing research for the Museum of the American Revolution. They have a collection of 190 so documents, all related to soldiers of color, and that includes not just Black soldiers but also Indian soldiers. It was a range. I mean, the Stockbridge tribe, well, the Stockbridge community, because it was actually a number of different people, Indians from a number of different tribes. But the lead tribe in the Stockbridge community was the Mohicans. But they actually, from 1775 on, pretty much every year they sent a company of Indians to the army. But also the Stockbridge community also had men serving in Continental regiments. So in 1778, when they decided to embody the Indian Company again, and this time to actually serve alongside the American Light Infantry, they actually pulled the Stockbridge men and also men from other tribes who were in Continental regiments. They actually pulled them out to serve in the Indian Company. I mean, I know one from Connecticut was Nipmuc. There's a few other there. I'm gonna have to consult my research, but there are a few other tribal designations in there. But it's the indigenous men were serving pretty much through to the end of the war. We don't really know numbers, but they were there. They were there. I mean, it's interesting because you can look at the First Rhode Island Regiment and see the numbers of Black soldiers in that compared to the Indian soldiers. That might actually give you a good idea of what the proportions were army-wide too. But the indigenous men did serve too. Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting subject. It's an amazing subject.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, John.
Sure.
I enjoyed your presentation. My research has shown that many of the generals brought their enslaved people with them, not particularly as independent soldiers,
Yeah.
but in their role where they basically served the generals. Did you come across a lot of that
Oh yeah.
in your
yeah.
research?
I came across early on. There's a series of letters from General Glover from Massachusetts. And again, it was one of the early pieces I found about black soldiers. He had his own servants that he brought with him, but he also put some of his enslaved men into the regiments, because at the end of the war, when he's leaving the army, he's retiring from the army. He sends a letter to Washington saying, I have two men and he names the numbers of the regiments. And he said, they're my servants, I want to take them home. And Washington writes back and said, well, if you can provide another man to take their place, you can have them back. They may be enslaved, you're slaves, but they're serving in the regiment. And unless you find a substitute, they're staying in the regiment. So that was really interesting to find. It was kind of eye-opening. And I didn't really address Washington's change of attitude, but it's there. It's really there. And actually, my cousin just told me yesterday that and I have the book at home and I've never read it. It's about Washington's it's about Washington. I just can't remember the name, but in that, and I have to go look for the letter too, but in that book, my cousin said there's a letter that says he wished he had been born in Pennsylvania. And the reasoning, what seems to be the reasoning behind that is, in Virginia, he was stuck in a system. He changed his mind during the war. There was a different attitude towards Blacks, but he was stuck in a system, in a social system, and also a business system of slavery. And whereas in Pennsylvania, the return of the Negroes in the army shows no blacks in one Pennsylvania brigade and 2 in another. Now, one of the reasons my cousin basically supports, it's actually a very minor reason, but he supports the fact that Negroes meant enslaved people. There were only 2 slaves in the Pennsylvania brigades. There were at least 30, 35, possibly even 40 black soldiers, free black soldiers. And when Pennsylvania enlisted a man, there's a, actually it's in the book, they enlisted a slave. And before he served, they freed him. So Pennsylvania had an entirely different viewpoint of slavery. I mean, Pennsylvania was the only state during the war to pass an abolition act. And, you know, some people say that, you know, those abolition acts that were passed by the early states were toothless. Actually, that had a lot more punch than a lot of people think. I mean, in one aspect, there's a Mississippi newspaper that my cousin found that talks, there's a Mississippi slave owner talks about, this is maybe early 19th century, I can't remember the date, but he talks about how he had taken slaves into Pennsylvania, and under the Abolition Act, and Washington had to deal with this too, under the Abolition Act, they seized the slaves, and they never returned them. And Washington had to take his slaves out of Pennsylvania every six months and then bring them back in. Otherwise, they'd be considered free, considered freed. So, yeah, it's an interesting, you know. And Washington definitely did change his attitude. He really did, and it didn't help that Lafayette was probably continuing pounding on him. John Lawrence, who was raised in South Carolina from a wealthy plantation owning family. He was really vociferous about the slaves too. Now, but in his case, and it never came to pass, but those black regiments that he wanted to raise, those men would have been enslaved soldiers and would have been freed upon the end of their enlistment. But still, he wanted to let them serve and to earn their freedom. So yeah, it's an interesting period. Yeah. My cousin mentioned the name, but I gotta when I got home, I gotta pull the book out and find it. And yeah, it is. Yeah, I can see the book's title, but my old brain isn't picking up I can't remember the title of the book. So, but it's a pretty well known and well regarded book. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Was the term African American in use before independence, or how did it come about?
African Americans probably, I mean, it might have been used maybe in the early 20th century. I don't know. It was not a period term. African was, men of color, black was used. And then of course, Negro was used. So yeah, the problem when you write a book is you don't want to repeat yourself all the time. So I basically used in my first book African American because you want to have different names. You like I said, you want to kind of change up the text and use different words. So
That was partly coming under the heading of when people got called American, whether they were black or white.
yeah, right. Yep.
All right, John, we do have one question online, and I think this is a good place to wrap things up, considering where we are today. 200 years ago, in the 1820s, you mentioned that enlistments in the Army for blacks was just not happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now that was a time where a lot of debates were going on surrounding pensions and things like that.
And the Missouri Compromise.
There you go. A lot was going on at that time.
Yeah.
Were black veterans entitled to equal pensions payments as their white comrades?
Yes. Yeah. They were given the same pensions. The problem was, depending where they were, their accounts were not always believed. I mean, I begin my first book with an account of I think it's a Virginia man writing to his congressman saying, one of my neighbors is applying for a pension, he says he was a revolutionary soldier. He's applying for a pension, and he's saying to his congressman, "Is he entitled to a pension?" Because that doesn't really say it, but it's like, he's a black guy. He can't. Surely he can't have a pension, but they did. There hasn't been a study. But it'd be interesting to see how many pensions of soldiers of color, both indigenous and black, were denied as opposed to white soldiers. Now that would be one hell of a study because there's thousands and thousands of those pension applications. But just to add one more thing, kind of related, during the debates for the Missouri Compromise, it was Colonel Forrest. I can't remember his first name now, but he was an artillery officer during the war, and he had actually played a big part at the Battle of Trenton. He served through till I think 1781 or so. During the Missouri debates, he at one point he said that if slavery was to be continued in this country, then his revolutionary service would have been the darkest time of his life, because he felt that strongly about abolishing slavery. And when the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which before the war was mostly was a Quaker-based organization, was rechartered in like 1785, 87, somewhere around there. The new lists of people, the list of people who had newly joined during the rechartering, there were dozens of Pennsylvania revolutionary officers. In fact, the 1780 Pennsylvania abolition law was based on a 1774 precursor that was actually formulated by the Chester County's Committee of Safety, and many of those members who had formulated that, at that time the law didn't go into effect, but they went on to become Continental officers in Pennsylvania regiments during the war. So yeah, slavery, the abolition of slavery, or the feelings against slavery, were in the North, in some quarters, were pretty vociferous. And that's what makes, to me, the war even more interesting, because as racial attitudes, or anti-black attitudes, hardened as you got closer to the 19th century, and then in the early 19th century, it went through the roof, up to the Civil War. Part of that is, okay, the cotton gin was invented, so okay, you can process cotton, which the cotton industry at that time just burst open. But it's also because abolition societies, some really radical abolition societies, started to form. So there was that pushback from slave owners against abolition, and then among them, and also some new immigrants, there was a lot of racism that grew and grew and grew and grew. But it's just an interesting period, and this is, I usually concentrate my ideas or my work on the nuts and bolts of the Army and the experiences of common soldiers and women with the armies and those things. But this subject gets far beyond that. And that's why I think it's really exciting. It's like an exciting subject, an interesting subject. And it's a subject that a lot of people still don't know much about. Which I hope eventually that's going to slowly but surely change. Knock wood.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. John, thank you very much for coming out. Appreciate it. Thank you for joining us in person and on Zoom. Get home safe, and we'll see you next
If you want to
time.
take a look at the books in the back, just pick them up and pour through them, and then my cards are back there if you want to contact me. And